This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Jamal.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, we have a great show today. We've got a lot to talk about in the midst of gun violence, pandemic, war in Ukraine still. There's a lot to talk about. And the two main topics that we're going to talk about today have to do with a New York Times editorial on who killed journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. I mean, the title makes it almost sound like the New York Times is finally coming clean on Palestine, but when we talk about it, we're going to find out that it's a lot more complicated, and the New York Times has still late to the justice table on Palestine, and still is wavering a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about Aipac and its attempt to attack Congress people, specifically Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Marie Newman, supporting their challengers in Congress. This is an unending battle that Aipac is doing, obviously, to attack pro-Palestine Congress, mostly women, as it turns out now. We've got a lot to talk about that because we have the midterm elections coming up, and there's a lot going on with that. But first, we're going to get to an interview that you did with Richard Silverstein and his article in Tikun Olam about, and I love this title of his article, Jamal, Israel's Paroxysm of Judeo-Hate. And he's going to be talking about what we've been talking about, that 70,000 person march in Jerusalem, where white supremacists, Israelis were chanting death to Arabs, we're going to burn your villages, basically a paroxysm of hate, Judeo-hate, against Palestinians, Muslims and Christians, basically. So really great show today, and looking forward to your interview with Richard Silverstein.
Few days ago, thousands of Israeli nationalists, many of them chanting death to Arabs, paraded through the heart of the main Palestinian thoroughfare in Jerusalem Old City. The crowds, according to Israeli media, were celebrating Jerusalem Day, an Israeli holiday that marks the capture of the Old City in 1967. Palestinians see this as a provocation. Last year, the parade helped trigger an 11-day Israeli assault on Gaza. Joining us to discuss this and more, Richard Silverstein. Richard writes the Tikun Olam blog dedicated to Israeli democracy and exposing abuses of the national security state. Welcome to Arab Talk, Richard.
Thank you, Jamal. I'm so pleased to be with you.
On June 1st, you published in your blog Israel's Paroxysm of Judeo-Hate Vile, chants of 70,000 Judeo-terrorists-in-the-making. Please explain, what did you mean by this?
Well, as you said, Jerusalem Day is an annual march of far-right Israeli Jewish extremists who shout slogans like death to Arabs, and this year they had some new creative slogans, creative in scare quotes, like Shireen is a whore. That refers to Shireen Abu Akleh. And they seem to want to, another slogan of theirs was, we will burn Shuafat. And Shuafat was the neighborhood in East Jerusalem from which Muhammad Abu Khadir came from, this 14-year-old child who was burned to death by settlers 4 or 5 years ago. So these are some of the most provocative, most outrageous, and most insulting chants that they could come up with. And the goal that these people have, and there were some estimates of as many as 70,000 of these people walking through the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and really terrorizing the neighborhoods. The Israeli authorities forced all Palestinians in the old city to stay in their homes. They closed all the businesses, Palestinian businesses in the old city. So this was a forced occupation of East Jerusalem in a way. Going back to what I was saying, This is an increasingly hostile, increasingly aggressive project by settlers and the most extremist individuals in Israel. And I need to say that while some supporters of Israel may say that these are the extreme fringe, that they don't represent all of Israel, I would really disagree with that because these views that they have are echoed in the political makeup of Israel, that the Knesset is dominated by parties and individual members of Knesset who either completely endorse these types of views or get enough support from radical extremists that that's what helps put them into the Knesset. So if you look at the leadership of Israel, the prime minister of Israel, even though he has a sort of a semi-moderate perspective compared to Bibi Netanyahu, the former prime minister. He comes from a far-right, pro-settler political movement, and in fact has advanced plans to transfer territory in Israel that is primarily made of Palestinians and transfer it to the PA and the Palestinian Authority. So he's in favor of what I would call ethnic cleansing light. So what my argument is that these settlers actually do represent Israel. You had the Israeli leadership approve the march, knowing that this was type of thing was going to happen, and you have politicians who support everything that these people stand for. So they are representing the state, even though it's not in a formal way.
You share actually the same view. I've had a conversation a few months ago with Israeli activist and author Miko Peled, who basically said the same thing because he doesn't like it when these marchers are described by the media as fanatics, right-wing, or just Kahanist, or as a fringe element. And then this is what he said. This is a major representation of Israeli society, and you share the same view. In the same article, you talk about a transformation in your thinking. You wrote that over the past 20 years that you were mugged by Israeli reality. You talk about the rise of Meir Kahane and the gradual process through you re-examined Zionist history. You wrote, and I'm just quoting you here, it was only then that I could re-examine everything I knew about Zionist history to understand that Israel did not suddenly become a fascist state, but that the seeds had been planted a century or more earlier at the very outset of the Zionist movement. Would you like to expand on this?
Sure. I think that what you have to do is look far back into Zionist history and go back to David Ben-Gurion as early as 1937 sends a letter to his son in which he talks about the need for a Jewish state that is a majority Jewish state, and that the Jewish element of this state will be dominant and have political rights, and that the Palestinians who would be left in this state would be subordinate, and the only Palestinians who would be welcome in the state would be ones who agreed to this subservient status. And that is what fueled the Nakba in 1948. That's only 9 years after this first letter that he sends in 1937. In 1948, he realizes in practice this plan that he's talked about in 1937, where you've expelled up to 1 million indigenous Palestinians from Palestine. You've also forbidden anyone who did leave in 1948 and become refugees in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. You forbid them from returning by calling them infiltrators. And a number of Palestinians who tried to return to their homes were actually killed for doing so. So, and that this infiltrator law also enabled the state to take over all of the property of the Palestinians who left. And in addition to that, you have the destruction of 400 Palestinian villages within Israel itself. So there was an eradication, an erasure of Palestinians within Israel that happened, and that's another part of this history that I'm talking about. And then, if you talk about 1967, it again was another sort of step in this movement of ethnic cleansing by the Zionist movement. And then after 67, you have the onset of the settlement movement, which the Greater Israel movement, they call it, which basically started to actually occupy not just Israel itself, but the West Bank and Gaza, and say that this is territory that in which Israel would have sovereign control, whether or not it annexed it. It did annex East Jerusalem and Syria, but it hasn't formally annexed the West Bank, although de facto it has, given that there are, I think, 800,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and in the West Bank. So this is a long process that many people do not, the Palestinians understand it, obviously, but liberal Zionists do not understand this history and want to believe that 1967 started all the woes and refuse to recognize that this is a long historical march towards what I call fascism. Of course, apartheid, which two nonprofits, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, have endorsed this term apartheid, which is also controversial in some circles.
You take it actually a step further because also last April you wrote a piece calling to designate Israel as a terrorist state. I think your article, this is Al-Aqsa under attack. Why Israel needs to be labeled a terrorist state. You wrote, today the world understands that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, its deliberate assaults on civilian targets, its eradication of the entire city of Mariupol, its execution of bound civilians, bring to mind the atrocities of the Nazi Wehrmacht and SS during World War II. The world now clamors for accountability, demanding that Putin and his generals be tried for war crimes. And then you go on to say Israel's terrorism has lasted far longer and killed more than Russia's. For the sake of moral consistency, it must treat the crimes of the Israeli state the same as the crimes of Russia.
Well, I think that you have to look at Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, and you can even expand that and talk about Israel's treatment of the frontline states, many of which it's invaded a number of times, in some cases like Gaza, and look at this, especially the treatment of the Palestinians, both in the occupied territories and even within Israel itself. There's a wanton disregard for civilians, a wanton disregard for proportionality in terms of the weapons that are used. Israel basically treats Gaza as a punching bag, and whenever a prime minister needs to have their opinion, favorable aspects, favorable political, when they're facing any kind of political crisis, they turn to Gaza and escalate the attacks there. And since 1948, Israel has killed as many as 40,000 Palestinian civilians and civilian Arabs in some of the other countries that it's attacked, like Lebanon. So this is a wholesale, massive state violence against a nation, Palestine, and against even, in some cases, against its own Israeli Palestinian citizens. It's a systematic approach that completely ignores any difference between military or civilian targets. There are some people who want to talk about Palestinian acts of terror, but what we have to remember is that Israel has the weapons of an advanced state. It's the eighth or ninth largest exporter of weapons. It's one of the world's premier manufacturer of the most advanced types of weapons. It uses those weapons on the Palestinians. In some cases, it it pioneers the use of new advanced weapons on the Palestinians so that it can go to the customers in the countries it sells these weapons to and say, we've field tested the weapons, we can tell you how it works. And they could show the country the lethality of these weapons that they're selling. So this is a really complex, comprehensive program of what I call terror that Israel has gotten itself into, and it's developed in even more massive ways over time. Started as an embryonic process and has become massive and systematic since then.
I mean, we know the position of the United States. I mean, the Congress and the administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, they have a very strong, favorable position towards Israel. But the media also plays a major role, and I'm probably taking you to the most recent event, which is the killing of the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. The New York Times on June 3rd published an opinion piece by the editorial board, and it's just the title alone says, "Who killed journalist Shireen Abu Akleh?" I mean, basically casting doubt on who killed her. And it takes me to actually a colleague of her, someone who I follow on Twitter, and she follows me back. She's also journalist at Al Jazeera, and she wrote that, which kind of made a lot of sense. It said there wasn't a single shred of evidence that journalists needed to believe that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia killed Khashoggi in its embassy. The only thing that we've had is that he went in, he didn't come out, but the body has not been found. There was, no eyewitnesses that testified that they killed him, or cameras, etc. Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered really on camera in full view in Israeli-occupied territory by a precision shot. There were eyewitnesses. There was another reporter who was shot in the back. Yet the New York Times end its headline with a question mark.
If you look at the language that the media uses in Shireen's case, if I can use her first name, Shireen Abu Akleh's case, and you look at any headline about the murder of a Palestinian by the Israelis, they always use the passive tense. Someone was killed. Someone died. They euphemize, if that's a word. They use euphemisms to describe it because it softens the blow and it makes Israel look less culpable for what it's done. And the language that's used refuses to take responsibility, both as journalism, but also refuses to hold Israel accountable for what it's doing. And this sort of heinous, atrocious type of journalism is exactly what happened in the case of Shireen. You had two absolutely precise and complex and investigations into her murder by the website Bellingcat, which is one of the most premier investigative forensic NGOs in the world, that investigated all of the evidence in her murder, investigated the videos, investigated the eyewitnesses, also had a forensic acoustic expert to listen to the gunshots to try to determine how far away the sniper was from her so that they could identify which vehicle the sniper worked from, and they could say that it was an Israeli military vehicle based on the distance. You had CNN, a mainstream American media outlet, do the same thing. So why the New York Times needs to ask?
And I should just add also, B'Tselem also refuted the Israelis' claim that they had skirmishes and they were showing a video, but the video was from another instance somewhere else.
Right. And this goes to the Israeli approach to these things, where they put out a conflicting narrative even though it's completely incredible and non-believable and can be dismissed out of hand, like this video that they showed of Palestinians supposedly shooting at someone who isn't pictured, saying that this might have been where the Palestinians might have shot her, when the investigations I referred to prove that these fighters were in a totally different part of Jenin, where the murder happened. But what they do is they put out a narrative, even though it's not believable. It's sort of like this old saying: if you throw spaghetti up against a wall, you're just hoping that a couple of strands of it will stick to the wall. And Israel is hoping that it creates just enough confusion, just enough counter narrative, that everybody who might be interested in this gets all confused. What happened? The Israelis say one thing, the New York Times says another thing, and another major media outlet says a third thing. We don't know what happened. That's what the Israelis want. They want that confusion because it completely obfuscates what they've done and refuses to hold them accountable. But there is one important way which might force them to be held accountable. The International Criminal Court announced about a year ago that they're going to commence an investigation into Israel's actions, starting with 2014 Operation Protective Edge, and they're going to include any incidents, any violence that Israel has engaged in since then. So every incident like this, especially since this is such a prominent incident in world media, will get included in the brief that they have to investigate. So we are very far from a formal investigation and from any trial that might happen in The Hague of Israeli generals or Israeli politicians. But this is the hope, and this is why Israel has attempted rigorously to damage the ICC investigation. It has harassed Palestinians who are cooperating with the ICC and the six Palestinian nonprofits who are labeled as terrorist entities by Benny Gantz, the Israeli minister. They were labeled terrorists because they're all cooperating with the ICC. So this Israel has this very complex way in which it not only avoids culpability, but it attacks BDS, it attacks the NGOs who have the opportunity to hold them accountable.
It attacks you also. I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about your work. What are you trying to do? What is Tikun Olam, basically? Not to confuse that with Rabbi Michael Lerner's.
Right. He runs Tikun magazine, and my blog is called Tikun Olam, which means repairing the world, and it's a traditional Jewish concept which calls for Jews to do good deeds, called mitzvot, which are deeds that are really invoked and commanded in the Bible of Jews, and I wanted my blog to be seen as a progressive alternative to Jewish media, to the communal consensus in the United States among Jews, Zionist consensus. And I wanted to present an alternative perspective on events in Israel, on the American Jewish community, on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So there's a kind of a wide spectrum of things I'm interested in. And as you said, when you are a dissident within an ethnic community or a religious community, people don't understand what you're doing because they're so used to this mind think, this sort of narrow vision of what's acceptable politically, what's acceptable in terms of religious and spiritual terms. And so much of the community does not understand what I'm doing. There are elements of the community that are already ideologically far right wing. Groups like Stand With Us, and really the whole Israel lobby of Aipac, American Jewish Committee, and we could go on. They are actually really hostile to the types of things that I'm doing. And there are other Jewish groups like Jewish Voice for Peace who are doing similar things, who also receive the same kind attacks. In fact, the Anti-Defamation League has labeled Jewish Voice for Peace as anti-Israel and sort of lumped it in. Often we are lumped in and said either we're collaborating with terrorists, or we are terrorists, or we're a milder form is to just call us anti-Israel, an attempt to
or self-hating, or
excommunicate
self-hating,
us,
or self-hating. That's a
self-hating, and one of the most disgusting terms they use is capo, which
capo.
were Jews who collaborated with the Nazis during the Holocaust. So that's all these things are common ways in which you can excommunicate someone from the community, you discredit them, you smear them, so that the rest of the community will not take anything that you do seriously. So if you look at where my journalism is accepted and endorsed and published, you won't find it at any Jewish publication, any official Jewish, um, format in the community. I'm not invited to speak to Jewish groups or in synagogues when these organizations often will sponsor Israeli speakers. I'm more welcome in the Episcopal uh, um, movement, and I write for two publications in London that are Arab oriented, the New Arab and Middle East Eye, because those are the entities that are more receptive to what I'm doing. And so as a result, because I'm not welcome in the Jewish community, I have to turn to other communities that are more welcome. And really, for me, who grew up in the Jewish community, it's really, in effect, a tragedy. I have had to accept the fact that I am never going to be accepted for who I am in the community. And that's
Do you feel
very
do you,
tough
do you
for
feel
someone
do,
who grew
do,
up.
do you feel there is though a shift in sentiment? I mean, is Israel's Hasbara failing? Some latest polls amongst Democrats found, at least amongst the young, that there's almost equal favorability between Israel and the Palestinian, which is kind of very unusual. This hasn't happened for many years, and a lot of the youth, especially on college campuses, etc., Jewish, I would say, youth, they basically have been more outspoken. They are more leaning towards Jewish Voice for Peace than organizations like Aipac or JCRC.
My oldest son, by the way, just as a personal example, has gravitated in that direction. He's gone on a tour. I think it's called Palestine Grassroots or Grassroots Palestine. He's gone on a tour of Palestine, and he is involved with these sorts of groups on the University of Washington campus. He's involved with a Palestine solidarity group called Super there. And so he's a perfect example of a young Jew who is alienated from the political views of the community. Luckily for him, he's a little bit more integrated. He's a little bit softer and less polemical than I am. So he's a little bit. He has one foot in one community and one foot in the other. But yes, what you said about the Pew poll is true. The younger generation is much more willing to be skeptical and question. The younger generation hates Bibi Netanyahu and everything he stands for. If you look at my generation, some will support Bibi, others will just stay neutral and say, I don't know enough about this to take a position one way or another. But the younger generation looks at American politics and looks at it skeptically and looks at the racism in American society and engages in what is called intersectionality, which is solidarity with foreign movements like the Palestinian movement, national movement. So the hope is for the younger generation to really change the outlook of the community. And you have examples of the Israel lobby organizations, like you mentioned, AIPAC, Stand With Us, the American Jewish Committee. Those are almost entirely the older generation, 50 plus, 60 plus, the billionaires, the wealthy white Jews, I call them. They are the dinosaurs they're going to die off. I'm actually of that generation since I'm 70 years old. So as I said, I'm a dissident in that generation, but uh, my generation is the one that will eventually pass. And I'm hoping that the younger generation will absorb these progressive values and really turn its back on the what the older generation stands for.
Richard Silverstein, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thank you, Jamal. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
That's the voice and the face of Richard Silverstein, with a really excellent interview that you did with him, Jamal, regarding his article in Tikun Olam about basically Judeo-hate, the Israeli paroxysm of hate that's engulfing the apartheid state. And it's not as if this is a new thing, Jamal, because the apartheid state is basically built on ethnic cleansing, hate, apartheid, all of those things, which is, has hate at its core of the indigenous Palestinian community. What's different is that you have Israelis now, or Jewish Americans, who are willing to write and speak directly to this issue, unlike at other times.
Well, I mean, listen, one thing you said, and actually we keep getting corrected, and I think the media in general has to be corrected about referring to these goons, in my opinion, as just a fringe element or extremist, because if you remember, we've had also Miko Peled, the Israeli activist and author, on the show, and he said, listen, don't refer to them as right-wingers or extremists. This is the core of what is Israel now. This is the face of Israel. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, trying to say, well, they're just the Kahanist, or that's how they're being described in the media, but in general, they reflect the sentiment of the state, especially since Netanyahu came into power and beyond. And of course, Richard Silverstein, when I had my discussion with him, he goes back to the core of Zionism, how that Zionism from day one had the plan for the ethnic cleansing and everything that now people starting to talk about, and creating an apartheid state and so on, that this is not something new that started just in the past 10 years or in the past 20 years or since 1967. It was the plan all along, which is very important to kind of understand.
Well, that's exactly right, Jamal, especially as we approach the 75th anniversary of the catastrophe and the Nakba next year. Commemorating the 75th kind of year of this ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians. But I think absolutely we can't describe them as fringe. We cannot describe it as a kind of a right wing. This is the core of Israeli society, is an extremist apartheid white supremacy society. But what is maybe a little different nowadays is, like, you have people like Miko Peled, Richard Silverstein, and others who are speaking up and writing about it, which is good. But it used to be, Jamal, that the Israeli Hasbara machine was a little bit better at whitewashing, greenwashing, pinkwashing, whatever washing you want to make, to talk about, making the desert bloom, all these wonderful things. But that patina, that washing of an apartheid state, it's getting dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, Jamal. They're not able to wash it anymore.
I don't know, how can you wash it? I mean, how can you wash basically a regime that has been certified by the United Nations, by Human Rights Watch, by their own human rights organization, B'Tselem? I mean, how much can you keep covering this up, and how gullible they think people are, which they're not. And we are in a whole different now age, the age of the internet, where you see in real time the images, the pictures of their ugliness. Millions of people saw the Israeli police attacking a coffin. They have no respect to the dead or the living. Imagine imagine if this happened like in 1948 when you didn't have satellite TV and you didn't have social
But
media.
that's what happened. But that is exactly what happened. You had mass murders, you had ethnic cleansing, you had entire villages like Deir Yassin, who were, where their inhabitants were slaughtered, men, women, and children, by the Irgun, and and the the kind of pre-state of Israel thugs and goons who went and terrorized indigenous Palestinians. So that's what happened before the birth of kind of the digitized media and cell phones and smartphones that we have now.
Well, that's
So
why
that's exactly right.
That's why we have the change. That's why they work harder at it now. That's why they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars
Right.
creating basically a ministry for Hasbara. They don't call it this, but basically that's what they have. They have a whole army that monitors social media. And sadly, they have their surrogates right here in Congress and surrogates in the media. And this is our next topic, talking about the New York Times editorial, which is really just, you mentioned, I don't see anything good in that editorial. It's totally disappointing. And you know what?
No, but I was just going to say the title was kind of seductive, because the title made you think like, okay, maybe the New York Times is coming clean, but they're not.
No, you know where I see the ugliness in this title? With the question mark.
Yeah, the question mark.
You don't have it. This is the question mark. It's meant to have you question whether she was killed by Israelis or not. When the whole world, when you had even CNN, which is unusual, saying CNN that Israel killed it. When you have investigators saying that the bullet came from the Israeli soldiers, and they refuted their claim that there were skirmishes from Beth Salem and whatever.
Right.
I mean, actually, Richard Silverstein and I talked about it earlier. So to me, why I want to talk about this, because even after you have that coverage and you had that global sympathy, I would say, that I've seen, because she's number one a journalist. So you had that kind of, she's also an American citizen, and she's a woman, and she's well known and whatever. So we had this global sympathy. And now, because there is going to be an investigation by the ICC, Qatar has officially filed for an application to investigate that. So that's coming from a country, because she works for Al Jazeera, which is a Qatari news organization. And so now they're little by little trying to cast doubt. They're following the New York Times by writing this editorial. And this is not someone sending a piece to the New York Times to get published. This is by the editorial board.
Exactly.
Which they put it very slickly, in a way like, okay, we're trying to be neutral, but let's listen. It's you know what? It's again, when Palestinians get murdered, there are two sides of the story. Let's listen to all the sides. And when Israelis get murdered, it's like, they got murdered. This is an act of terrorism. This is
right. That's the thing. That's the thing that I really hated about the so-called editorial, because really it's Israeli propaganda in the New York Times, Jamal. What I hated about it is that, again, the title minus the question mark almost makes you think like, okay, the New York Times is going to come clean, but you're exactly right. Rather, it's a both sides of the story kind of thing. Both the Israelis and the Palestinians need to investigate, blah, blah, blah. It's the same kind of two-sided BS that we see all the time from the New York Times, from the New York Times and from the corporate media all the time. And let's be clear to our readers, to our viewers, to our listeners, there's no two sides to this. Israel murdered an American citizen journalist in its military. They targeted her, they murdered her. They almost killed her cameraman. They shot him in the back. He survived by the grace of something. He managed to survive. But the New York Times is living up to its reputation, Jamal, of being a propagandist and a kind of mouthpiece for the Israeli Hasbara machine.
Just a reminder to everyone, when we talk about the New York Times, supposedly this is the publication of record, right? That's how it's been described. And it's a very important publication in the United States, but I want to remind everyone that it was also that the New York Times that wrote several articles, not one, about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction.
100%, Jamal. That's 100% true. And I also want to remind our viewers, listeners, anybody who's listening and watching, that it's also the New York Times that's talking about all the heroism and all the great things that are happening in Ukraine right now. Again, the one-sided kind of reporting and warmongering, if you will, in support of what NATO and the EU and the United States is doing in Ukraine. And only now, we're not going to talk about this in detail. You're beginning to see little snippets of what you and I have been talking about now for months, which is, well, Russia looks like it's, getting a lot stronger, doing a lot of things that are indicative that they could achieve their kind of strategic aim there with horrific cost to both Ukrainians and Russians. But that story, which we've been trying to articulate, only now the New York Times, little drabs of that after months of supporting the American basically war machine that's been supporting Ukraine and, contributing to the destruction, I might say, of Ukraine and the killing of so many innocent Ukrainians. So, the New York Times wants to be called the newspaper of record, but they're really a propaganda machine in many of these regards, Jamal.
You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. So just last week, we talked about the NRA and we talked about Aipac, which are basically two sides of the same coin. I mean, when it comes to death and destruction and being two of the largest lobby groups in Washington, D.C., and they bring you nothing but bad. And now, as we are approaching the elections, the midterm elections and primaries, of course, you're going to see the work of the Aipac, and they are targeting basically Congress or representatives who are critical of Israel, that they will actually put a question mark about, let's write a blank check to Israel, or we want to commemorate Al-Nakba, just like we commemorate the Armenian massacre and other things like this. And so now let's put they want to put all their energy and all their support and money in basically getting rid of them, making them lose the elections. And I'll start with specifically two candidates, because this is just like now developing within the past couple of weeks or so. The new PAC, not that new, but it's been endorsed by Bakari Sellers. And you've seen Bakari Sellers on, if you haven't, people who haven't heard of him, he's usually on CNN. And now it's planning to spend upward of $1 million to support one of the candidates trying to unseat the progressive and pro-Palestinian independence representative Rashida Tlaib. Okay, so that sounds like, well, who's Bakari? Where did he come from? He's an African American, and he, I mean, I was trying to I've seen him many times, and I'm like, why? I mean, here he is. Why is he targeting Rashida Tlaib? Basically, the first Palestinian woman and Muslim and one of the two Muslim women in Congress. She's part of. She works amongst the African American community. I mean, she basically her supporters in Michigan, and you should know better than me, are African Americans there.
Exactly.
Right, and so then I dug deeper into his background. Well, guess what? I mean, despite his relative youth, and Bakari Sellers is a veteran operative for Aipac.
He's always been that, Jamal.
The American Israel Political Action Committee. And, you could go read different articles, one of them by the Electronic Intifada. Sellers was recruited way back in 2004 when Aipac had just begun a massive campaign at historically Black colleges and among even younger students of color nationwide. So he was like a real big find for them. He got invited to travel, those trips, the Hasbara trips, full accommodation, paid for 2 trips to Tel Aviv to meet with politicians, etc. And since then, he's been just going to all their conferences every year. He's featured there, and now he's basically trying to create this confusion in the African American community, which supports in Michigan, which supports Rashida Tlaib along with other minorities, Arab American minorities and others, and trying to drive a wedge, which is really
That's
sad,
right.
because saying that Rashida Tlaib is not working hard for the African American community, and she's focusing
Right.
on other issues, being part of the squad, and kind of, it's anyway, we could talk for hours about this, but now he is basically raising money to
With
support,
the help of Aipac, with the help
with
of
the help
Aipac.
of Aipac, of course. It's his group, and to support basically the candidate Janice Winfrey. She is the current Detroit city clerk, who, by the way, says that Israel is very important for our national security. Like the United States.
Where
needs
where
Israel.
does that talking point, does that sound familiar to you, Jamal? I wonder where she gets that
I know.
talking
I mean,
point.
here is a city clerk from Michigan thinks that Israel
City clerk from Detroit,
from
who should
sorry,
be worried
not
about
from Detroit.
who should be worried about the city of Detroit, which has its own problems, to think that Israel, an apartheid state, is in the national security interests of Detroit, Michigan, is a little bizarre. But having said that, it sounds like she and Bakari Sellers are best buddies now, and they've just taken over the AIPAC talking points. But this is not new news, Jamal.
No,
The
but
AIPAC has always looked for African American, Latino, folks of color to act as their surrogates by giving them money and support to advocate for pro-Israeli ideas.
But
I want to go back.
This is not just advocate for pro-Israel idea. This is to advocate and to unseat,
Right.
basically, in this case, a Palestinian American representative, Rashida Tlaib, and then we'll talk about the next one, which the other one is Mary Newman from running in Illinois, also because of her stance on Palestinian issues and supporting Betty McCollum's resolutions, which we spoke about that.
Right.
Also for supporting the commemoration of An-Nakba. In fact, just this past weekend, Mary Newman went in Chicago and she spoke in front of Palestinian Americans who raised the flag and to commemorate An-Nakba, etc. And in her case, and this is, I think, in she's running in the Democratic primary, of course, in Illinois' newly drawn 6th congressional district, which covers the suburbs of west of Chicago. And so, I don't know if you know much about Mary Newman, but she got elected in 2020, just defeating and unseating Lipinski, who is a very, institutional. I think he's been there for at least 18 years in power, and is oppose right to abortion, anti the LGBTQ plus community protections, and anti-immigration, etc. And so she's very progressive, and now they want to unseat her.
Well, of course, Jamal, they want to unseat her, not because she's progressive, because AIPAC will support you if you're so-called progressive. It's the PEPs that they want to go after.
PEPs, progressive except for Palestine.
Progressive except for Palestine, because one of the strategic angles that AIPAC and their supporters use is they will support right-wing extremists and so-called progressives as long as they get on the apartheid Israel bandwagon. And she hasn't, Jamal. She's, she goes to Chicago. She goes to a Nakba commemoration. She's supporting Betty McCollum's, work with Palestinian children, obviously, and some of the great work that the Congresswoman has done. And so, of course, AIPAC is going to go after her. But, sadly,
So in her case, just to say, kind of like this
yeah.
is a spin-off, they use the Democratic Majority for Israel, PAC, because
of course,
because
they're
AIPAC.
not going to use the Republican committee for Israel. They're going to use the Democrat committee.
I know,
Of
but
course.
this is the committee that writes checks. AIPAC basically directs funds because AIPAC
Right.
does not directly write money, but in fact, now they are endorsing her opponent, Sean Casten, and who has raised $2.7 million so far, just including a last payment of $46,000 by this PAC and another $16,900 from the New York Democrat Coalition Action Fund, which is also associated with this PAC. And they're taking a whole ad campaign in Chicago, and it says, "Say no to a corrupt politician representing us. Say no to Mary Newman."
Yeah.
This is how the ad reads, running along, paid by the Political Action Committee for Democratic Majority for Israel. The ad is one of several ads basically attacking her, and more are supposed to come in the coming next weeks.
Well, it's typical. I want to just refer back to something you said last week, and we've said, many times before. Why is it that AIPAC is not forced to register as a foreign lobbying group?
Exactly.
I mean, that's basically what they're doing. I mean, can you imagine, for example, if there was a PAC for China support, China supporters,
or
Democratic
Iran, or Iran,
or Iran, or Pakistan, or whatever, and somebody, there's a military colonel who got indicted this week for doing some backhanded lobbying for UAE. He's going to jail because he didn't declare himself as a foreign agent of UAE in attempting to lobby for them. Yet AIPAC, Bakari Sellers, these different PACs are pumping in millions of dollars for people to support the strategic interests of a rogue apartheid regime. They get away with it. So, the question still stands: how are they allowed to do this and not register as a foreign agent?
They shouldn't, and we should keep asking this question time and time again. And I think others are asking this question. And again, I repeat just what we said last week. I mean, you have two destructive, basically, PACs in Washington, D.C., AIPAC and the NRA, that lead to nothing but destruction. There is nothing good that comes out from these two organizations.
Well, unless you consider mass murder, unless you're a big supporter of mass murder, because since our last program, Jamal, there have been 12 more mass shootings in the United States in the span of a week since our last show. 12 more mass shootings, doctors getting killed, children getting killed. I mean, that's the work of the NRA, and you have a similar destructive path with AIPAC. And even though nothing but destruction comes from these organizations, they get away with it. They literally, Jamal, get away with murder, and nothing is done about it.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest episode, and we will speak to you next week.
See you next week.